Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. Today we are going to begin making the model mold for the half-life size sculpture we made during the Beginner's Guide to the Figure Sculpture video series. The model mold will be made out of plaster, and in this episode we are going to make one model mold piece. The main point of this video is going to be to show you or teach you how to work with plaster. I'll take you through every step of the process as they happen in real time so you can get a real feel for how this goes. Let's get into it. Before I start, I get my workspace ready to rock and roll. There's a few reasons for this. Plaster can be messy, and the second you start, you are working against the clock, so it's very helpful to have everything you might need ready to go right in front of you. To make the process as painless and as clean as I can make it, I make sure everything is within arm's reach on my table and that everything I might need is present. I also have a bucket of water that you can't see underneath the table for cleaning tools and my hands, and the floor is of course covered with plastic to speed up the eventual cleaning process that we'll do at the end. Mixing plaster is very straightforward. Important thing to remember is to put the powder into the water. Always do it this way, powder into water, not the other way around. I sift the plaster into the bowl slowly, letting the water soak into the plaster. You don't want to dump a ton of plaster in at once, as this makes a big lump of powder which the water will have issue penetrating into instead of an evenly mixed plaster and water mixture. I keep adding plaster into the water without stirring and going slow until I get this little island of plaster poking out of the water. Now we want to let the plaster soak into the water, as this minimizes the amount of mixing that we need to do. Mixing introduces air bubbles and speeds up the setting time of the plaster, so less mixing is better. So we have a few minutes here, and it's a good time as any to cover the wood and the metal pole with Vaseline so the plaster doesn't stick to them. This makes the molding and cleanup much easier. I use my designated Vaseline brush to do this, as once this brush has been used for this purpose and is covered in Vaseline, it can hardly be used for anything else. In the meantime, the plaster is allowed to properly soak into the water. Now it's time for me to mix our concoction of plaster and water together into one even plaster mixture. And to do this I use a metal spatula, but you can really use anything. You might even use your hands. I've done this process many times, so I'm doubling up on some of the tasks that I'm doing here, doing things while waiting for other materials to set up, etc. You don't have to do that. You can always change some things around here if it's your first time doing this, in order to limit the amount of stress that you'll feel. Perhaps do the Vaseline before doing anything else, for example. Your first time around, it can be smart to also write down an order of operations list that you can follow, so you know what the next step is going to be, and so that you don't lose track of what's happening. The first layer of plaster gets applied on its own and is a detail coat meant to capture all the details of the silicone. I know people who skip this step entirely, but I still prefer to do it. If the mix is too thin, if my plaster mix is too thin, you'll have issues with the plaster separating and spreading on your silicone. If the mix is of proper thickness, however, this shouldn't be too much of an issue. Go over an area once and then again a few minutes later, and you should be able to cover the silicone with no problem. This layer of plaster doesn't need to be super thick. It's actually better if it's a little bit thin, but I like it to be at least a few millimeters thick in order to give it some toughness so that it doesn't crack, as the next step requires us to apply some pressure to it, but more on that once we get there. I try to apply an even thickness and a fairly smooth layer of plaster here. It doesn't have to be super smooth, as later layers will be the beauty coats, if you will, but it's nice if there's not a ton of hill and valleys where air bubbles can be trapped on this layer. I try to work very clean, as a clean approach tends to leave us with a better mold, in my opinion and in my experience. Once the plaster is on there, you don't want to mess with it too much as it tends to get pulled off the surface as you apply more plaster. So a light touch can help you with this a little bit, but just be careful. I use a metal spatula to clean the edges of excess plaster. Again, keeping every step as clean as you can only helps further our goal of creating a fine beauty of a mold. Now we let this layer of plaster set up a little bit, and in the meantime we can busy ourselves with the task of prepping the next step. We have to cut burlap pieces which we will embed into the next layer of plaster for strength, and we will need a variety of shapes and sizes. You'll see that the burlap is easy to manipulate once we wet it with the plaster, so we don't need to cut perfect pieces here. The burlap can be bent and shaped into whatever shape that we might need. It's good to have plenty though, so that you don't run out in the middle of applying them. I let the first layer dry for 10 to 15 minutes while cutting the burlap. The plaster should be dry to the touch, but don't wait so long that the plaster has time to start heating up. Then you waited too long. Before it gets hot, the plaster will have the easiest time bonding to itself. In order to help with the burlap bonding to the old plaster, I apply fresh plaster again before I begin with the burlap step. Burlap is straightforward to apply. You dip the burlap in the wet plaster mix and squeeze out most of the excess plaster. More plaster doesn't mean a stronger mold, it means a heavier mold, which we don't really need. With the burlap soaked and squeezed, I can apply it to the surface. I use a light but firm touch to lay it down so that there is no air bubbles between the first layer of plaster and the burlap. A spot like this can break, or will probably break, leaving me with a hole on the inside of my mold. I want my burlap close to the edge, but not over the edge. It doesn't really have to go up on the edge either, even though sometimes I do this. Now it's time to rinse and repeat this over and over again. Every piece of burlap needs to overlap the last one in order to create a strong, solid mold, otherwise you end up with weak areas which will crack. I let them overlap a little bit and keep track of how many layers of burlap I've laid down. In the end, I want to probably get around 3 layers of burlap on there. Now, for a small mold like this, I tend to cheat a little bit and overlap a little bit extra rather than a little bit too little, and then I only do 2 layers. For a small mold like this, it should be fine, but if you're working on very large molds, it might be smart to do 3 or even 4 layers to make sure that there is plenty of strength to support the weight. Burlap is plenty flexible, so if a piece is too wide for the leg, for example, I simply fold it over to make it fit. When I do the second layer, I'll make sure I fold it on the other side as to not build up an excess of thickness on one side while leaving the other fairly thin. The burlap doesn't have to be pretty, but I still want to maintain a clean edge. I want the burlap to not be flopping around loosely on the surface. Every thread of burlap that hangs loose from my mold has the potential of beginning to rip up embedded burlap and slowly eroding my mold. So I make sure everything is covered in plaster, though I don't need it to be pretty just yet. At the end here, you'll notice that you can still see the burlap weave through the plaster, and that's fine. That just means that I haven't applied too much plaster, and we won't have a heavy mold. And we'll have plenty of time to make this pretty a little later on. Let's take a quick second to talk about how you can support the channel. Subscribing and liking the video is of great help, of course, but if you would like to get something in return for your support, head over to my Patreon page. On Patreon, you can watch exclusive content like the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which we just completed, and the Portrait series, which we just started. Here I will show you everything you need to know about sculpting portraiture. You can also get personal feedback on your own work from me on anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out. There's a link in the description below. With the 2 layers of burlap down, it's time to build the plaster wall along the edge. The edge of this mold is where it's weakest, and it's where it's going to start breaking apart first. So we want to make sure that we reinforce it so that that doesn't happen. And the way we do that is to build a wall of plaster along the edge, essentially an extension of our silicone walls. This will give me a nice square edge running along the length of the mother mold. It will be very strong and unlikely to break, while at the same time giving me some room to rasp it nice and smooth, so that anyone handling this mold won't cut themselves on sharp plaster. You'll remember that I didn't place the burlap too close to the edge or too far up the edge, and if the burlap is too close to the surface here, which it is not, but if it was, the fibers would come out once I begin to rasp. Which is exactly the reason I left the burlap slightly below the edge, so that the fibers won't reveal themselves as I rasp this edge a little bit later on to clean it up properly. I let the plaster set up a little bit until it's kind of like cottage cheese in consistency before applying it with a metal spatula. Now, this is more of an art than a science, and it takes practice to do this fast and efficiently and make this look good. A nice rule of thumb that you can attempt to follow is to make the plaster wall about as thick as your thumb and as tall as your thumb. So essentially, go for the width of your thumb in both directions, and you should have a fairly solid plaster wall. Also remember that this can be rasped down to perfection later on. However, it is much nicer and much less labor intensive if you can manage to get the wall looking nice without resorting to the rasp, or at least keeping the rasping to a minimum. You can see me using a couple of tricks here to achieve this, one of them being using the silicone wall as a reference for the height of the plaster wall and kind of bumping my tool up against that silicone wall. The plaster wall extends outwards at the same height as the silicone wall before making a 90-degree turn down towards the surface of my mold. You might need to go over an area a few times in order to get this right, proper thickness, proper looking, but that's okay. Working the plaster in the same section over and over again helps eliminate air pockets in the wall, which are going to end up being weak spots. And you'll get a nicer result if you take your time and go over it a few times as well. The last step of the process is going to be installing the support pole. This is just a cut down aluminum broomstick from the local supermarket. You can really use anything, wood, or a metal that doesn't rust. This will provide a little stiffness to the mold and will ensure that the mold won't flex. It also provides me with a handle to help get the mother mold off the silicone. Though this handle is not going to be super strong, so I wouldn't and shouldn't go ham yanking with all my force on this handle. You have to be a little bit careful with it. More importantly, it will provide me with a convenient place to attach the bungee cord that I'll use to hold the mold shut during casting. And this is perhaps the handle's most used and useful feature, now that I think about it. With the pole installed, I used what little plaster is left here to clean up the surface and make the mold nice and neat. Or at least as nice and neat as I can make it and I have energy to make it. And that's it. That's pretty much all you will need to know before diving into making plaster mother mold shells. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week. If you want to support the channel, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below the video to learn how. Until then, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.